The biggest winner for the Jets in the 2024 NFL Draft might be their highest profile player. We're talking Jets draft winners and losers today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, March 2nd, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GettingGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I admit it, I have a competitive side, and it's a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. Well, the NFL draft is now in the rearview mirror. It's tough to believe it was 1 week ago. 1 week ago tonight, the Jets traded down and drafted Olu Fashanu out of Penn State. And on today's show, we're going to talk about the players already on the Jets roster who are winners or perhaps losers based on what the Jets did in the 2024 NFL draft. And believe it or not, to me, the biggest winner is the player who is probably the most entrenched on the Jets roster, and that's the starting quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, because I think what the Jets did in the NFL draft is going to help him out quite a bit. Now, I think we all knew heading into the draft, the Jets' focus was probably going to be mainly on the offensive side of the ball because that's where they needed a lot of help. Jets had probably one of the top 5 defenses in the league last year and probably one of the top 5 defenses in the league the year before. The defense, there are a couple spots where it could stand to improve. I think, they could stand to add a safety. They could certainly add some defensive tackle help behind Quinnen Williams. But for the most part, this is a defense that's very good. There aren't a lot of holes on this defense. Whereas on the offensive side of the ball, the Jets tried to patch some holes up during the offseason. The 2 tackles they brought in, Tyron Smith and Morgan Moses, should help. Mike Williams, the wide receiver, should help. And of course, getting Rodgers back from injury should certainly help quite a bit. Upgrading from Zach Wilson, Trevor Siemian, and Tim Boyle to Aaron Rodgers, that should certainly, do some things at the most important position on the field. But if you look across the roster, there's also a real lack of young talent, really across the board on the offensive side of the ball, outside of Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall. And the Jets helped themselves out in the long run, but I think you could also say that they helped themselves out in the short run. Now, prior to the draft, there were a bunch of rumors out there that Rodgers preferred a playmaker, a wide receiver to an offensive lineman. And, it's difficult to say what those rumors really meant. It's difficult to say whether they were true or not. Sometimes these things, are rumored behind the scenes and they're not true. Sometimes they are true. To me, it didn't really matter what Rodgers wanted, though, because Aaron Rodgers has shown us that, he's not a very good GM. Alan Lazard was here last year because of Aaron Rodgers. Randall Cobb was here last year because of Aaron Rodgers. We can presume Billy Turner was here last year because of Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers' input on player personnel, shouldn't really move the needle for the Jets because he's shown he doesn't really know what's good for him. And if he did want, and I don't know if he did, but if he did want a playmaker over a tackle, it doesn't necessarily mean that was the right move for the Jets. I think in many ways, the tackle was the better move if you're focused on the here and now, because even though Olu Fashanu is not going to be a starter right off the bat, he's going to play a very important role. Your third tackle is a guy who has to play frequently in the NFL. The offensive line is an area where injuries happen. Maybe not to the degree we've seen them happen to the Jets over the last couple of years. The Jets have just been so unbelievably banged up on the offensive line. They've had to rotate their offensive linemen they've had to throw so many different offensive line combinations together. And when guys get injured, it's not just that you're dropping in quality from starters to backups. Offensive line's a spot where chemistry matters a lot. And when you have to shuffle guys constantly, and sometimes what the Jets have had to do is they've had to change guys' positions. So even guys who are staying in the lineup have to learn a new spot, and they have to get used to playing to a different guy next to them. When Elijah Vera Tucker moved out from guard to tackle the last 2 years, that changed the right guard, and it changed, who the center was dealing with next to him. The chemistry really matters. You don't want to have to deal with all these injuries, and it's inevitable though. And that's the challenge. And especially when you got Tyron Smith. I mean, when the Jets signed Tyron Smith, I think there were 2 things you could expect. When Tyron Smith's on the field, you can expect his quality of play to be very high. But you can also expect him to miss quite a few games because of injuries. And Rodgers is not really a guy who is going to be able to protect himself to the way he has for most of his career. Part of what made Aaron Rodgers so unbelievably special was not, he wasn't like a vintage runner like a Lamar Jackson or somebody like that, but he was a guy who was so good at buying himself some time. And those lateral movements, breaking the pocket to move either right or left, throwing on the run, that was like vintage Aaron Rodgers. And he's not going to be able to do that at anywhere near the extent he has in the past. I mean, look, I'm not saying like he'll never, break outside the pocket. Of course he will. There will be plays during the season where he moves to either his right or his left, but he's not going to be able to move it as fast. And that means he's not going to be able to do it as often, as successfully. And that means that, look, he's going to have to win from the pocket. He's going to have to kind of convert his game to something, I don't know, like Brady-esque. Tom Brady's game was always built to age well. People always talk, when people talk about Brady playing great up into his mid 40s, part of that, his game was really just built to, withstand the test of time. He was a guy who never really moved that much. So, when his movement skills diminished, it didn't make a difference because it's not like he ever really moved that well to begin with. He was always a guy who was confined to the pocket. Rodgers is going to have to adapt his game going forward, and that means staying in the pocket more frequently. That means, and look, we know he can win from the pocket. It's not like his entire game was based on, running left and right. And we know that, he can dissect the defense better than anybody else in the league right now. He knows, I mean, he's been in the league. This is going to be his 20th season. Not his 20th season starting, but he was drafted in 2005. So this is going to be season 20 for Aaron Rodgers in the NFL. He's seen everything. Every combination, every blitz, every look that could be thrown at you, he's seen 100 times. Any coverage you could throw out, any complex look, any disguise pre-snap, he's seen it 100 times. You can't fool him. And if the Jets can protect him in the pocket, he's still probably is going to be pretty successful. It may not be the vintage Rodgers, it may not be the MVP level of Rodgers, but if you can protect him, you're probably going to like the results that you get. So adding Fashanu, when we talk about everything we just mentioned about how Jets have a really, really good left tackle, but not a tackle who's you can count on to stay healthy. And you have to have somebody who could protect Rodgers. Adding a tackle in the first round. Look, I liked it more for the long-term perspective because the Jets needed to add a tackle. Now the Jets don't have to worry as much about what's going to be starting at left tackle for them in 2025. That was a big concern of mine heading into the draft. The concern is now really alleviated, but it's also for this year. Fashanu, I don't know if he's going to be great right off the bat. A guy who may, need to add a little bit of strength to his build. But look, I mean, when the alternatives were, Carter Warren protecting Aaron Rodgers' blind side or Max Mitchell protecting Aaron Rodgers' blind side, now we've got a blue chip prospect in Olu Fashanu. Even if Olu Fashanu is not going to be great right off the bat, I still like what I have. I still like what we've got there. And then, adding Malachi Corley, it's just another weapon. When we talk about Rodgers being 40, he's probably not going to be able to carry the load as much as he used to in the past. Now, I think some people, again, I've talked about this on the show the last couple of days. I think some people have set expectations that are a little unrealistic for Corley. But I do think definitely one area where he's going to be helpful is he's going to be a guy you can just get the ball to in space. You can just throw him screens. You can, diagram touches for him to get him the ball in a position to make plays. And every time you do that, every time you just toss the ball to Corley, that's one last time Aaron Rodgers needs to drop back in the pocket and do something special and decipher a defense. And the Jets are going to need Aaron Rodgers to be played at a really high level this year. But to the extent you can take some of the load off a 40-year-old quarterback, to the extent you can ask him to do a little less, where maybe there's one or two less plays a game he has to make to move the team forward, where you just dump it off to Corley, let Corley make a play with the ball in his hands. That's going to be helpful. So, I mean, I look at this and I think Aaron Rodgers, we don't know whether, he expressed publicly that he was very happy with what the Jets did. And how can you not? If you're Aaron Rodgers, the Jets got to protect you. You want offensive linemen in front of you. Aaron Rodgers has been the beneficiary of some phenomenal blocking. He's been the beneficiary of some phenomenal offensive linemen in Green Bay through the course of his career. And, I think he should know the value of what the Jets have. And so I think looking back on this draft, I would have to say Aaron Rodgers is winner number one from the New York Jets, but he's not the only winner. As you're on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about some players whose roles may increase, some players who may not lose their roles because of what the Jets did not do in the draft. We'll discuss some of these guys continuing here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Monopoly Go. All right, game off. We got to pause here to talk more about Monopoly Go. And I know what you're saying, flag on the play. You already talked about that. But there's just so much good stuff in this game. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with your friends for timed tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. And the more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock. And there's so much more to get. Unique stickers you can trade with a friend, to complete albums for big prizes, cool new playing pieces to travel the boards with, hilarious emojis for taunting friends when you smash their building or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton include their own mini games like digging for treasure, and there's always something new, like timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win, or wrench frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench and go download it for free on Google Play or the App Stores. Game on. Again, it's Monopoly Go. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you every day, as this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today, we're talking about Jets draft winners. Which players already on the roster were the winners from what the Jets did in the 2024 NFL draft? We talked about Aaron Rodgers a bit. Now, there was a move the Jets made. It was during the draft. It didn't really impact their 2024 draft. It was a trade. They sent John Franklin Myers to the Denver Broncos for a future 6th round pick. So it's not even like, it's not even like the Jets got to pick this year. If they got to pick this year, you could tie it to the draft. You could say, well, the Jets drafted this player. So it's really for a future draft. I mean, John Franklin Myers, I guess, will be tied to the 2026 draft a little bit when the Jets get that 6th round pick from Denver. But it happened during the draft, so I'm going to include it in this show. And the trade of JFM opens up playing time for two guys. One is Will McDonald, the other is Michael Clemens, and it opens up playing time for them in different ways. For McDonald, it opens up that third defensive end spot, and we had talked on the show about how, barring another move after the trade for Hassan Reddick, it was difficult to see where Will McDonald's playing time would come from, because Robert Saleh may rotate his defensive lineman in and out, but if you look at like the way snaps have been allocated under Saleh, that means that the third guy kind of gets starter level snaps. The fourth guy, the number 4 defensive end, he plays, but doesn't get that many snaps. And McDonald was looking at being the 4th defensive end. So he was kind of looking at being the odd man out. And that seemed very ominous for a guy who was drafted in the first round a year ago. I mean, it seemed like the Jets were, honestly, it felt like unless the Jets made this trade involving JFM, it almost felt like the Jets were borderline giving up on Will McDonald. So this is an opportunity for Will McDonald to grow. Now, I've heard people suggest that, Jermaine Johnson had a slow first year and Will McDonald's was similar, but I don't think that that's really true. Jermaine Johnson was actually a pretty significant part of the defensive line rotation in year one. He played that third defensive end role. He had a bunch of run stops that year. He had a couple of highlight reel plays. He wasn't a big time pass rusher, but Jermaine Johnson was a player year one. McDonald was not. McDonald essentially got a redshirt year to try and work on his game, to try and work on his technique. And he was an older prospect when the Jets drafted him. And all this means is that I think this is really a make or break season for Will McDonald entering year two. And now he will have an opportunity to get some playing time. He will have an opportunity to compete. Clemens, gets an opportunity to move into that 4th defensive end role. And it's not a big role, but I do wonder a little bit whether the Jets will find more time for him, because JFM was he kind of played the power end role. It's what I refer to as the power defensive end role in the Jets defense. Now the Jets may mix up what their roles are on this line, but JFM was kind of a guy who he was a unique player in that he's like 290 pounds, yet he played defensive end in a 4-man line. In 4-man lines, typically your 2 defensive ends are lighter than 290. If you play a 3-man line, then you'll get 3 guys who are like in the 290, 300 pound range. But when you play a 4-man line, usually guys are a little bit smaller on the defensive end spot. And I think part of the reason the Jets played the bigger end is that they like to have a lot of speed in the back of their defense. And when you have speed, you're playing with smaller guys at linebacker. You have safeties who aren't adept at shedding blocks. So essentially a bigger guy prevents the other team's offensive line from getting to the second level, from getting on your linebackers and safeties. And they don't, if they can't get to the second level, then your linebackers can just play straight, they can play sideline to sideline football. They don't have to shed blocks. They don't have to fight through traffic. Now, losing JFM means that you don't have that. Just as I mentioned, the 4th defensive end role in Saleh's defense traditionally does not play a lot. But there have been some suggestions that Clemens's role could increase this year. I think that might be the reason. I think if you see the 4th defensive end get more playing time than he has in the past, it's because Clemens is like the guy on the defensive line who profiles as the player who could maybe take on, I don't think he can be as good as JFM, but take on that role as power end. So it perhaps opens up a little bit of playing time for Clemens, even though, there's only so many snaps to go around. So I don't think he's going to get that many, but I think it's possible the fourth defensive end could get more playing time than he's gotten in the past, at least relatively speaking. I think that's a possibility. I would also look to the tight end position when you talk about guys who are winners. I think the fact that the Jets did not pick Brock Bowers is good news for Jeremy Ruckert, because Ruckert was looking at being the odd man out if the Jets picked Bowers. Second tight end in the Jets offense, again, a guy who has a role. The third tight end, not so much. And Ruckert, his first two seasons, has kind of been buried behind Tyler Conklin and CJ Uzomah. And I would say for Ruckert, it's probably not a great thing that he hasn't been able to he wasn't able to beat out Uzomah for a spot for most of his first 2 years, because it's not like Uzomah was dominating. But Uzomah is now gone, and there wasn't anybody to step in Ruckert's spot unless the Jets drafted Bowers. Now, if the Jets drafted Brock Bowers, Bowers would have taken on the first tight end spot. Tyler Conklin would have dropped to that second spot. And Ruckert really would have been a situational guy. I mean, maybe you'd see him in some heavy offensive sets when the Jets went three tight ends in power situations, short yardage situations in the goal line, but he wouldn't really had much of an opportunity. And speaking of make or break years, I mean, this is kind of a make or break year for Ruckert. I mean, he really has not done a whole lot those first 2 years. Again, he's been buried behind the bench, behind Uzomah on the bench. And when he's gotten opportunities, it's not been stellar. I mean, the thing with Ruckert is he's inconsistent as a blocker. And sometimes you'll see somebody post some video of him dominating a block, of him just throwing this incredible block on social media, and it gives this perception that he's a dominant blocker. Whereas he's more of a very hit or miss as a blocker. Where when he hits, he really hits, and you see, it is a highlight reel block. But when he misses, he really misses, and it's been very, very up and down for him. And he hasn't really contributed much as a receiver. So, he's got an opportunity now. And again, this is year 3. I mean, he's got the role now. There's really nothing stopping him from succeeding, and he's got an opportunity. And speaking of the tight end position, Zach Kuntz, he was a late round pick a year ago. He had incredible athletic testing numbers. Guy who's just off the charts as an athlete, and didn't really have much in the way of developed skills as a tight end. If the Jets had drafted the tight end this year, that may have been it for Kuntz, because there are only so many spots at the tight end position. And, if you draft another tight end this year, that becomes like the new developmental player. It's tough to keep 2 developmental tight ends on your team, on your 53-man roster. So this gives Zach Kuntz a pathway to making the roster. He'll have an opportunity to show he belongs. And, there was some buzz heading into the draft, leading into this process, that maybe the Jets would be looking at drafting a tight end late, and they did not. So it means another opportunity for Zach Kuntz. So, when when nobody's drafted at your position, it's a good thing. And I think it's especially true for Jets tight ends this year, because now they're going to get more of an opportunity to contribute. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn our attention to some players who were not so lucky. There are some players who maybe shouldn't feel as good about their roles after what the Jets did in the NFL draft. And we'll talk about who they are as we continue here on this Thursday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and even more. Exciting time in New York. Knicks and Rangers both in the middle of playoff runs. Fans hoping the Knicks can bring home their first NBA championship in 5 decades, and the Rangers trying to win their first Stanley Cup in 30 years. Exciting time. Both teams looking like they're in pretty good shape, at least at the moment. And you can win even bigger, because again, FanDuel gives $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. Again, it's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. We're talking about Jets draft winners and losers. We've talked about the winners. Now, which players on the Jets roster come away from this draft probably not as happy, because it's mainly because the Jets drafted their potential replacements. I think I would start with Xavier Gipson, because there's like a 1-to-1 replacement here. The Jets traded up for Malachi Corley in the 3rd round, and Corley is if nothing else, Corley's going to be a guy who gets manufactured touches, where the Jets are going to try and get him the ball in space. And that was kind of Xavier Gibson's role at the end of last season. He was the guy that got, maybe an end around or two a game. He was the guy they were throwing screens to. He was a guy who lined up in the slot quite a bit, which is where Corley projects to line up. He was the return guy. Now, Corley did not return much in college, but I think he's going to get an opportunity to show what he can do on kickoff returns, because the whole reason the Jets got Corley was his ability to make plays with the ball in his hands in space. So this, especially, I don't know, everybody, like any move that's made these days, like people have a theory it's because of the new kickoff rule. I'm not sure if you follow what the NFL changed its kickoff rules this offseason. So nobody really knows what the outcome is going to be. But whenever any team makes any move for a player, people have some speculation it has something to do with the new kickoff rules. I do think Corley's going to get a shot to return kickoffs, though. Just because you didn't return kickoffs in college, that's not necessarily meaningful when we're talking about your ability to return kicks in the NFL, because your ability to return kicks in the NFL is really, can you make plays with the ball in your hands? And that's Corley's game entirely. Xavier Gibson now, his roster spot's in jeopardy. I mean, there's no way around it. And I mean, look, it's not like Xavier Gibson. Xavier Gibson will live in Jets lore for that walk-off touchdown return in overtime in the opener against the Buffalo Bills last year. But after that, I mean, he really didn't do that much. I mean, I've heard a lot of Xavier Gibson praise relative to what he actually brought to the table. I mean, look, he was an undrafted rookie. Not that you're expecting that much, but he was an undrafted rookie. I don't know how much upside is really there with Xavier Gibson. And Malachi Corley's presence, I mean, almost makes Gibson obsolete. So I think when we're talking about guys who are losers, I mean, that would be the first player who comes to mind. Izzy Abanikanda, I mean, look, these may have only been day 3 draft picks, but Braylon Allen is Isaiah Davis. Jets drafted 2 running backs day 3. And Izzy Abanikanda was a day 3 running back a year ago. It's kind of what I was getting at with Zach Kuntz, is that when you're kind of the developmental guy and then they draft a more recent developmental guy, it does not bode well for you. And, I've been struck by like how many Jets fans like had him penciled in as the number 2 running back. Hasn't done much in the NFL to really justify that. I don't think. I mean, not that it was his fault. I mean, the Jets couldn't block anybody up front last year, but he got some opportunities late in the season, and it's not like he ran with them. And it's not like a guy who was a day 3 pick last year who didn't contribute much as a rookie should have like a lock on any role for the team. Jets draft 2 running backs in the late rounds. Now, the one good thing for Izzy is that neither of them stylistically is that similar to him. Both of these guys both Allen and Davis project as more kind of like inside runners, whereas Izzy's more of a burner. So from that standpoint, maybe Davis and Allen are competing with each other. That said, I mean, you still can't be thrilled when 2 guys are drafted at your position and you're one of the backups. It seems somewhat ominous for Izzy Abanikanda. Another guy who I think we're talking about, like he was never projected to have that big of a role, but I do feel like Max Mitchell's roster spot's in jeopardy after the addition of Olu Fashanu, because you've got 4 tackles now who you can probably guess are going to be on the team. Tyron Smith's obviously not getting cut. Morgan Moses obviously not getting cut. Olu Fashanu is obviously not getting cut. So those are three locks at your position right away. I think right now in the hierarchy, Carter Warren's got to be ahead of Max Mitchell. So I think Max Mitchell's rosters. Can he play guard? I mean, he didn't really look that great when they did try him out at guard last year. Could Max Mitchell be heading to the practice squad now? If the Jets had done nothing at tackle, they hadn't addressed tackle till the late rounds, I think there's a possibility. I think Max Mitchell would probably be sitting pretty well when we're talking about can he get a roster spot. But after the moves the Jets made, I think his roster spot's probably in some degree of jeopardy. And, listen, maybe they keep him around. Maybe he can earn a spot. Maybe he can carve out a spot at guard. But, I would not be feeling that great if I were Max Mitchell right now. So, there's some guys, and look, these are all later round picks. And essentially what it boils down to is that when you're a late round pick, you don't really get a grace period. You pretty much, it's tough to be a late round pick, because when you're an early round pick in the NFL draft, like you get opportunity after opportunity because teams want to justify the pick, and teams aren't going to give up on a pick on somebody they invested a lot in. Whereas when you're a late round pick, teams almost assume you can't play unless you prove them otherwise, and they will quickly look to find a replacement for you. And that's the case with the guys I just mentioned. I mean, really, when you talk about Abanikanda, when you talk about Max Mitchell, Talk about a non-drafted free agent like Xavier Gipson. He wasn't even drafted. He was a non-drafted free agent. Teams will look to move on from you quickly if you don't immediately flash. It's a tough world, but that's the world of the NFL. And that's why I think these are the guys who probably can't be happy with what happened in the NFL draft for the New York Jets. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.